Hey y'all, welcome to Killer Queens, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, Torella, and like most millennials, I've always had an obsession with true crime. On KQ, you'll find light true crime stories, millennial hypes and gripes, some adult language, and maybe a special guest here and there. Just like a 90s sleepover, we're just a couple BFFs hanging out, so gather round and let's launch right into it. The Busby family was a typical family living in a sleepy beach community, but in August of 1979, all that came crashing down when John Busby was shot and nearly killed on his way into work as a police officer. While John knew his assailant, who it was from the instant that the trigger was pulled, the man responsible would escape justice completely because of his connections with their community. Oh, and trigger warning: murder, attempted murder, gun violence, and arson. Listener discretion is advised. I do want to give a hey girl thanks to Valerie P for requesting this case. I had never heard of it. I am instantly obsessed with it, or was instantly obsessed with it. And it's one of those just very intriguing cases. It's still heavy, but not quite as heavy. And thanks to Mark for writing this one up. As always, love you. Okay, so for today's case, we are headed to Falmouth, Massachusetts. Falmouth, Massachusetts. Wow. I haven't even eaten lunch yet, so I don't know what to tell you. I don't know. Falmouth, Mass. We'll just say that. Nestled on the southwestern tip of Cape Cod, Falmouth, Massachusetts is a treasure trove of scenic beauty, historic charm, and vibrant local culture. Whether you're seeking sandy beaches, outdoor adventures, or a relaxing retreat, Falmouth has something for everyone and is sometimes referred to as a coastal gem among visitors, with some of Cape Cod's most beautiful beaches. I would love to visit this place. It sounds really gorgeous. There are opportunities everywhere for outdoor enthusiasts to go swimming, paddleboarding, and windsurfing. And there is also a ferry offered that will take passengers to Martha's Vineyard from the nearby ferry port of Woods Hole. But Woods Hole isn't just a ferry port, it's also a global hub for marine science and oceanography. And I wanted to be a marine biologist when I was in the second grade, cause 90s. We all did, I think. How many of you wanted to be a marine biologist in the 90s? Raise your hand. I can't see them. But I feel the hands being raised right now. Everything was like Free Willy and those like picture things. We had one on our wall. Well, on my side of the room. Tori had her stuff on her side of the room. I had my stuff on my side of the room. And mine was one of those like what did you call them? Not changing eye, but it was like you had to move in just the right way and like look in just the right way to see what the actual picture was. And mine was like whales and dolphins and stuff. And I just loved them. I loved marine biology. And I was like, I'm going to do that. That's what I'm going to do. And then I don't know what happened. It just sort of went away. But anyway, this is where I should have gone, right? There are 3 different government branches with a presence in Woods Hole: the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Geological Survey, and the National Marine Fisheries Service, as well as several private scientific research facilities. Much of the research performed here is collaborative amongst the different facilities, and there is also a local aquarium, the Woods Hole Science Aquarium, which draws in families from all over. When it comes to other outdoor activities, Falmouth also has a 10.7-mile bike path/trail, the Shining Sea Bikeway, where riders can take in breathtaking views of beaches, marshes, and woodlands. The town saw brief action in the War of 1812 when British ships bombarded the coast, but Massachusetts militia quickly made their way to the beaches and prepared for a British landing, but ultimately the British never made the push for land. When the town was originally settled in the way back times, like the 1600s, there was obviously no census or any real record keeping, but the historical population dates back to 1850, when the population was just over 2,600, which I feel like is a lot for 1850, right? That's kind of a lot, I would think. So it was just over 2,600, and that's where it stayed until it saw a bump in the early 1900s to 3,500 residents. It would steadily rise for the next few decades, reaching just over 8,600 residents in the 1950s. And then a huge jump in the 1960s to just over 13,000 ushered in a huge population boom compared to what it was before. From the 1970s to current day, the population rose from 15,000 to 33,000, according to the 2023 census. And that for Falmouth is like huge. It's giant. It's gargantuan. And some of you listening from large towns, like we're right outside of Nashville, that's still as big as your mama's Jack Russell. That's itty bitty, teeny tiny, weeny woony. It's just precious, isn't it? 33,000. Wow. The small town has a vibrant, I said it twice. The small town has a vibrant theater and arts community with different theater groups and projects taking place all the time throughout the year. At one point, Ben and Casey Affleck actually lived in Falmouth. They moved there when Ben was 3 and Casey was born in Falmouth. Various notable people have come out of Falmouth or called it home from time to time, from athletes to musicians, writers, and Sunita Williams, who is a NASA astronaut and U.S. Navy officer. I mean, some big names out of Falmouth. But as quaint and charming as Falmouth seems to be, that's not why we're here. And you knew that. Mark always likes to give us a soft start. You know what I mean? He's like, look, this is a great town. There's a lot of great stuff about it. And now we're into horrific times. Okay. That's over now. It was great, but it's over now. Now we're going to talk about things that are not so quaint. We're going to talk about the Busby family. Now, the title is a little misleading because yes, the family did disappear, but not in the same way that we typically talk about. Normally, when we talk about somebody going missing, a missing person, or we have talked about families that have gone missing, it's because typically something awful has happened to them, or we just never know. But this story is quite different. Cylin Busby was 9 years old and born in Falmouth when her family's whole world changed. So she has 2 older brothers, Eric and Sean, and her parents, Polly and John Busby, loved having the family on Cape Cod, so close to the beaches. They also lived near an old cemetery, and Cylin remembers that she and her brothers and their friends would go and play around the cemetery. And she was like, that sounds really morbid, but it was so beautiful. It had like lush green grass and these really like beautiful old trees that were great for climbing. They loved playing in the cemetery. It didn't scare them at all. There was a ton of space to play tag and hide and seek. And she says that growing up in Falmouth was like growing up in whatever your ideal place to grow up is in your mind. Like if you can think of like that idyllic, picturesque, like after school special way to live and grow up, that's what it was like in Falmouth. So John was an officer with the town of Falmouth Police Department. He worked the overnight shift, so he would go on patrol at midnight. And during the day, so that John could sleep, Polly would make sure that the kids were out of the house because he needed to get his rest before he went to work, right? So she would always have them doing something so that he could rest. In the summers, Polly would take all the kids to Old Silver Beach and they would spend the day there. And Cylin says by the end of the summers, they'd all be extremely tanned. And she called it brown as berries, which I thought was kind of funny. But she said it was just like an awesome way to go through life. They just loved it. In the summer of 1979, Polly was studying to become a nurse, and to help wrangle the kids, their older cousin Kelly had come to stay with them. Cylin kind of made a joke that Kelly, who was 18 at the time, by the way, we're getting some of these quotes from, there's a 48 Hours episode on this case, and Cylin does a 2-camera interview, so she talks quite a lot in it. She has also written a book with her father about this case, so lots of good info in there. But she kind of made a joke that like Kelly really was there to have fun, you know, like she gets to spend the summer on Cape Cod basically. But in order to basically pay her rent, she babysat the kids. So she helped out with the kids. She got to hang out and do some fun stuff. but that was kind of her, like, how she earned her rent. As a patrolman, John was a very by-the-book officer. To his children, he looked like something out of a movie. They said that he looked like an action star when he was in uniform, and he seemed invincible. And I gotta tell you, John Busby in his heyday, hottie. Absolute hottie. He did look good in a uniform. And he has that, like, very strong jawline, just like, he was one of those men. Like, Polly said that he made them feel very safe. And it was like, if he's around, nothing can hurt us, like, he's going to keep us safe. That was his job and all this stuff. And, like, I mean, you would feel safe around him. He was a big brute man. But John took his job very seriously. He was not the kind of guy you wanted to mess with. He was not one to back down. He was not one to be like, oh, well, I'll just look the other way because you have connections. That's going to come into play. He was going to do what needed to be done. If you broke the law, he was going to make sure you got your ticket. He was going to make sure you paid your fine or you went to jail. Other officers said that John was the one that they called when a fight needed to be broken up somewhere because he wouldn't hesitate to jump in and do what needed to be done. John's supervisor at the time said that when it was warranted, John got physical with suspects, but he was a fair cop. He wasn't just out to attack people and abuse his position in the community. Polly says that when she and John met and fell in love, he was very confident. He was very handsome. He was an athlete at the time. And she said after they had children, he was the kind of dad who was always on the ground, wrestling, rolling around with the kids. He would play, they'd horseplay together and stuff like that. He was very, very active. And, they had 2 boys and 1 girl. So with the boys, he's roughhousing. He's down on the ground with them, all that kind of stuff. And then he was like the daddy who was always there for his little girl. And, it was just really sweet. There's a lot of really sweet pictures of him with the kids when they're younger, before this occurred. On August 31st, 1979, Cillin said it was a regular day. Polly had the kids outside. It was a Friday. It was the start of Labor Day weekend. And they actually have a picture from that day of the children out in the driveway. So Polly had to find something for the kids to do because John had to work at midnight that night. So the thing that she decided to have them do was paint John's car. So there they are out in the driveway. They're painting John's Volkswagen Bug. And Cillin says this photo is so hard to look at because of what was about to happen. And she said, when I look at this photo, and I think obviously most of us don't have anything this major that happens in our lives, but I do think that everybody has something in their life or just a point in their life where, like, things change. Maybe your outlook changes. Maybe you're, whatever. Maybe you lose somebody. Maybe you lose a friendship. Maybe you, just like, maybe you lose yourself, I mean, there's just so many things. But there's almost that, like, before this and after this kind of thing, right? Or just I used to be that person. The person that I used to be, that I knew myself to be, is not here anymore. But when I look at that picture, I see her. She was there. And that's the photo for Cillin. It's the last photo before their entire lives changed. And she said she just looks and she sees this little girl that, like, directly after that, everything changed for her. Her childhood was taken from her. It ended, she said, after that. And you can see in the picture, she's just a little girl with not a care in the world, right? Like, not a care in the world. And that all changes just hours after that picture was taken. So that night, John got up, he got ready for work. The children were already asleep in bed, so he leaves in his car. And then later in the night, Cillin was woken up by someone screaming and crying. And she said initially she thought it was the TV just being turned on really loud or something. Polly remembers after John left, she was watching TV and there was a banging on the door. And she said she was watching Benny Hill. She was laughing when the knocking started. When Cylin came out to see what was going on, she saw one of her dad's friends, Rick Smith, standing in their home in uniform. He's also a police officer. And her mother sobbing and screaming, no, 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 no. And she kept trying to like push Rick away. When Rick was talking to Polly, he told her that there was an incident involving John and that he had been shot. And it was incredibly chaotic and scary for everyone involved. Kelly had come out of the room that she was staying in, and Polly told her that, she's got to go, but she's going to call home as soon as she knows what's going on. And then Rick takes her away in a patrol car. As she drove down the road, she said she could see police lights everywhere. And as they passed, she saw John's car in the road, but it was riddled with bullet holes. Can you imagine the fear? Like, that's my husband's car. And the likelihood is that he was in that vehicle when those bullet holes went through it. Oh my gosh. I can't even imagine. So they get to the hospital. The doctors and nurses are frantically working on John, and he was still conscious at this time. And Polly said he kept motioning, like, because he couldn't talk, he kept motioning that he wanted to write something down. So they gave him a notepad and something to write with, and he wrote, "Polly and kids not safe." And he underlined safe to get his point across. So back at their home, Kelly and the children were waiting for any word of what was going on. They knew it had something to do with John, but they didn't know what had happened. Before Polly and Rick left, they said, look, make sure you lock all the doors. No, don't turn any lights on. Keep all the lights off. Stay away from the windows. I honestly can't believe the police left them there. The fucking kids by themselves. I mean, Kelly's 18, but still she's a kid. Like, Polly, I get, she has no idea what's going on. She's just told that, like, there's been an incident with John. But, like, based on the information that you're going to get about the scene, I am just very surprised that they were like, okay, kids, just lock the door and best wishes. We'll come back later. Like, oh my gosh. But anyway, that's what they did. So Kelly made sure everything was locked up. She made sure all the lights were off. They waited for a while. And then they saw the headlights of a car pull in, and they fully expected that to be a police car to come and let them know what's going on, or to come get them, bring them to the hospital, something like that. But it wasn't. It was a red car, and a guy got out and he was holding a rifle. And Kelly didn't recognize this man. And so they start to panic. They're all absolutely terrified. And then the man starts banging on the door. And at this point, he's not saying anything. He's just banging on the door. They're freaking out, right? But she's telling the kids, like, don't make any noise. Like, we have to be quiet, like very like Ross, like, his little motion for quiet down. So they're being really still. They're being really quiet. She said trying to run out like the back door or something wasn't an option, just the way the house was set up. There was no way that somebody in the driveway wouldn't see them, and they didn't really have anywhere to go that would be out of sight kind of thing. So they had to stay inside the house. So they just stayed quiet. They stayed still, and they were just hoping that the man would leave, that they would be like, okay, nobody's home, and he would leave. This guy he's not just like knocking, he's banging on the door, and it's getting louder and louder and louder. He's banging harder and louder on the door. And they're like, oh my gosh, when is this going to stop? And then finally it just stops. And so Kelly takes a deep breath and she's like, okay, they're gone. We're going to wait just a little bit longer, but they had to have left. And then the knocking starts again, but now it's at the back door. And so she's like, all right, new plan. She told the 3 kids, you guys go upstairs in the attic and you hide. And you do not come down unless I come up to get you or your mom comes up to get you. Do not come out for anyone else. And they were all terrified. So she gets them up into the attic. And Cylin actually says, she's like, I'm wearing a nightgown. She's 9 years old at the time. And she said it was hard to balance on the rafters. And she just kept thinking, like, I have to stay still because if I fall through, the insulation is going to be prickly all over me and I'm going to make noise or whatever. So they're up there. And Kelly was like, I had to make it look like I was the only person home. If whoever that person was gained entry into the house, it had to look like it was just me and nobody else home. And she fully expected that if that man got into the house, that she would be killed. And she knew that was going to happen. But she did it anyway. And she put them in the attic. and said, because she knew their best hope if somebody were to break in was that she could just act like Polly had left with the kids. If she hid in the attic too, they might go looking in the attic for people and find all of them. So at least if she's by herself and being like, oh yeah, they took off, I don't know, then it would just be her. Like, what a maternal instinct. What a boss, you know? So she goes to the window near the door and she's like very carefully trying to look out to see if she can see anything. And the man finally pulls out a police badge and is like, hey guys, it's me. I'm a police officer. I've been sent here to watch over your family. And Kelly was like, oh, thank God. So she's like, kids, you can come down as the police, and they're all super relieved. Why he approached it this way, I am not sure. But I feel like that information could have been given earlier than that. But here we are, and it's a long time ago, but like, really? You couldn't have, I would lead with that next time, sir. That's what I would lead with, honestly. If I'm being honest, I would have led with that. Throughout the night, more and more officers showed up to watch over the children, and they realized quickly that something really big was happening. I mean, they're literally sending like 9/10 of the Falmouth police force at this point, I would think. It's got to be tiny, right? Back at the hospital, doctors and nurses were fighting to get an airway down John's throat, but they said that he was really tense and they couldn't get him to relax enough. They had even given him morphine to knock his ass out so they could put an airway down his throat, and he would not let himself go to sleep and he wouldn't let himself relax. And the doctors were like, dude, you have to relax. I have to get this down your throat. And then Polly said she remembered an officer coming in the room behind her and saying, hey, there's an officer at the house with the kids. They're safe. We have more officers on the way. They are okay. They are protected. And Polly said it was immediately after that, John let his body relax and the doctors were able to get him intubated. And she said the doctors were like, I've never seen anything like that. But I mean, this man was like, you got to be fucking kidding me. You think I'm going to fall asleep right now? I don't even think so. You think I'm going to let you put a tube down my throat? I don't think so. Talk to me when my kids are safe, okay? Because then we'll talk about this intubation situation. Like, holy moly, he had the power over morphine, y'all. That's some strong shit. Not for John. After John was sedated and on a ventilator, he was taken from the hospital in Falmouth to Mass General in Boston to do the surgery. They told Polly that they got him there in time to keep him from bleeding out, but he would need to be really strong to make it through the surgery that they were going to have to do on him. So let's talk about what happened that night. John left their home. He was making his way to work his overnight shift. And he says, as he's driving, a car came up behind him and it started to move beside him, almost like it was going to pass him, go around him. But it didn't. It just stayed next to him. And then he heard the shots. He had been shot with a shotgun and he'd been hit in the left side of his face and it had blown his jaw off. And Polly described it as from the nose up, he looked normal, but there was just no bottom jaw. Like it was just gone. Holy moly. A call was placed about the shooting and officers quickly arrived at the scene. The call went out that an officer was shot, and so obviously everybody dropped what they were doing. Rick got to the scene and John was still conscious and he was holding towels up to his face to try to control the bleeding. Rick did say he was shaking violently, but he was conscious. And Rick was like, John, who did this to you? John, is that how they say it? Who did this to you? And I'm trying to like Boston, but I'm not good at that. John couldn't speak, obviously. He has no bottom jaw. And he did not physically see his attacker, but he knew who had shot him. He always carried a small notebook with him, and so he got it out and he wrote, not an accident. Mel Rainey did this. Holy moly. So let's talk about Mel Rainey, if we must, because yuck. Mel is a very reminiscent character of like a Ken McElroy. I don't know if you guys remember that case. That was main feed 262 from March of 2023, in case you want to listen to it. Mel owned Five Star Enterprises garbage collection in Falmouth, and the police department was very familiar with him. Unlike Ken McElroy, who was huge, he was very large in stature. Mel was this teeny tiny 5'0" little twig, but he had a reputation for being a bully. And you know who he reminds me of is, in that movie, The Town? I love The Town. Oh my gosh. I haven't watched it in forever, actually, but it is like literally one of the movies that for the longest time, like I never owned like DVDs or whatever, but I owned Love Actually, I owned The Town, and I owned When Harry Met Sally. And that's almost it. But I love The Town. Anyway, the guy in The Town who was the florist and who's very old and what was his thing? He would say, I'll clip your nuts or whatever. But he was a small guy. I mean, he was much older then, but he was like a small guy. And it kind of reminds me of that. It's like, he himself is not necessarily going to carry out the dirty work, but he's scary and has built his enterprise up to where he's got enough people working underneath him. And he's got enough connections with law enforcement and stuff like that, that like, he's just going to do whatever he wants to do. And that's Mel Rainey. He had contracts all over Cape Cod for his business. He made a lot of money on that. He was also a convicted arsonist because when someone crossed him, and it really didn't have to be major. It really didn't have to be this like, I don't even know what. I mean, obviously nothing warrants arson, but it didn't have to be major things like, I killed somebody you love or, like it would just be whatever. If you crossed him, he would set your shit on fire. And that was just his MO. And he would warn you that he was going to do it too. Because if you crossed him or you rubbed him even the wrong way, and I'm talking like looked at him the wrong way, anything like that, his favorite phrase was, I smell smoke. He would say, I smell smoke. And that was his way of threatening without outright being like, I'm going to burn your house down or whatever. I'm going to burn your business down. I smell smoke. Almost as sinister as you really should be more careful with silk. So in 1968, Mel Rainey was convicted of arson and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he only served a third of his sentence, of course, because why wouldn't he? He was also suspected in the murders of 3 separate people. This is before this shooting, you guys. The first was his first wife, Wanda. She was last seen in East Falmouth in March of 1971. Mel claimed that he took her to the bus station. He dropped her off because she was going to go visit a cousin. And then she was just never heard from again. And he reported her missing after 5 days. And the case was immediately went cold. It was never solved. She's never been found. About a year after Wanda went missing, but I will say literally everyone in Falmouth is like, oh, he fucking killed her. Like there was no question. As soon as she was reported missing, they were like, oh, he killed her. Like, that's just who he was, right? It was that obvious. And then about a year after Wanda went missing, Shirley Souza had moved in with Mel Rainey, and she had been a babysitter for them when Wanda was still alive. And there was a neighborhood boy, Jeff Flanagan, who had dated Shirley and was still interested in her, and he went missing. And Shirley was, I feel like 17. I didn't write it down because I thought I would remember it. She was 17, 18, maybe 19. She was not yet in her 20s, I don't think. Jeff Flanagan was also a teenager, if I remember correctly. And he had dated her before and he was still interested in her. But guess who else was interested in her? Mel Rainey. So Jeff Flanagan's body was discovered in a cranberry bog across the street from Mel's home. He'd been shot to death with a shotgun. Not to say that other people in Falmouth didn't have a shotgun, but sound familiar? And no arrests were ever made in his murder. Paul Allwards was 17 years old and had worked for Rainey. Now I'm wondering if I'm getting Shirley and Jeff's ages mixed up with Paul. They were young, though. I know they were young. I think these were all teenagers. Anyway, and I don't know whatever happened to Shirley. Like, I'm sure she was terrified. Anyway, so Paul had been working for Mel Rainey, and he'd been working with the police and the prosecutors and was set to testify against Mel in one of his arson cases in front of a grand jury. And the police promised that Paul would be protected. So they made plans for him to go stay with family in Martha's Vineyard. And they told him, don't say who you're staying with. Don't say where you're going. Don't tell anybody. You get on this ferry, which they escorted him to. They got him onto the ferry. They watched him get onto it, but he never got off the ferry. He wasn't there when the ferry got to Martha's Vineyard, and he's never been seen or heard from since. Who else was on the ferry? Obviously somebody who worked for Mel. Oh my gosh, that's terrifying. So Mel Rainey walked free on pretty much every charge that was ever levied against him. In one instance, the police chief's car had been set on fire in his front yard. And everybody knew that it was Mel Rainey that had done it because that was his thing, but nobody did anything. The police were afraid of him. The local, government was afraid of him. When they talk to people in the community, they're like, he had to have something against somebody. It had to be much bigger than just, oh, Mel Rainey has a reputation. Because, he had a reputation or whatever, but there had to be some reason that nobody would prosecute him, really, that nobody would hold him accountable. And it wasn't just him that wasn't held accountable. That extended to his family. Mel felt like he was untouchable, and he also felt like his family should enjoy that benefit as well. So, if they were given a ticket or anything, Mel Rainey would march his little ass to the police station and he'd have it torn up and all the evidence of it removed from the logbooks. Now, remember, this is 1979. These are physical logs, okay? And so that would just go away. But remember, John Busby was not someone who would just be pushed aside when it came to upholding the law, not even for Mel Rainey. So one evening there was a fatal accident and John was conducting traffic at a road closure while the scene was being processed and cleaned up. Now, Mel Rainey's brother, John, was there in a semi. He got impatient. He didn't want to wait. He shouldn't have to wait for this fatal accident where somebody has died. That's a you problem for John Rainey. I shouldn't have to sit here and wait on this. Do you know who I am? It's giving, do you know who my father is? So John Rainey cannot be bothered to wait. And instead of waiting for the scene to be cleared, he just drove through it, as you would, right? And as he did so, he hit John with his vehicle. Now, he didn't run him over, it's a semi, but he definitely bumped him or touched him or something. But contact was made. So John went to his house and arrested his ass for assault and battery with a deadly weapon. Now, guess what? John Busby was shot on the evening of August 31st. And guess what court hearing was scheduled the next day? The hearing for this assault and battery charge. Back in the hospital, John made it through the surgery successfully, and he woke up from his sedation. He looked around and he slowly started to piece everything around him together. He realized he couldn't talk, so he motioned for Polly to get him something to write with. And he wrote her a note saying, "Don't leave me like this." And she said, he didn't want to be hooked to a ventilator. He didn't want to have to be on life support. So he was letting her know if she ever had to make the choice, take him off of that he didn't want to live this way. What was left of his jaw had been wired shut, so he was not able to eat. He couldn't drink. He couldn't sleep comfortably. It was a rough recovery. After the shooting, there were several officers who wanted to go to Rainey's house and drag him out, but they didn't because they didn't want to get in the way of detectives or taint any type of investigation. And Rick says, if you go to any police station in America and you ask the officers, what would you do if one of your own officers was shot in the line of duty? They would tell you, we would not stop investigating. We would not stop looking for answers. We would not rest until an arrest was made. But when John was shot, none of those things happened. The local paper usually posted the police log from the evenings. Example, 8:44 accident by library, 8:58 fireworks going off, 9:20 fight in progress. But if you go to the night that John was shot, there was nothing. It was removed from the log. They did have mentions of dogs barking and 2 drunks fighting. But John being shot was removed from the logs completely. This goes all the way up to the president, I think. It goes all the way to the top. Mel Rainey's got some shit on somebody, right? Rick says that to his knowledge, nobody ever went to Mel Rainey's house to interview him or talk to him about the shooting. It was clear to many officers that there was more going on behind the scenes. Was Mel paying people off? Did he have information to blackmail? But it just, whatever the issue was, nobody was going to investigate it. Nothing was going to happen. So in the hospital, John learned what was going on with the investigation and he saw that it wasn't going anywhere. And so he thought, well, that just means I need to recover. I need to do it quickly and I need to do it well because I'm going to have to kill him myself. He would have to take justice into his own hands. And while normally I would say we don't advocate for vigilante justice, and we don't advocate for that on this podcast. I loved this energy from John Busby at that point because I'm just like, yeah, fucking get him. Like, nobody else is going to do anything. And this man is wreaking havoc and he's killing people. Are you fucking kidding me? I'm sorry. Like, whoever it is, district attorney, a judge, like whoever it is that Mel Rainey has some shit on, I think that him killing this many people, attempting to kill another, committing arson after arson after arson, the pictures he has of you dressed up in your wife's lingerie or whatever is really small potatoes compared to that. Like, I don't know what he had on whoever it is that he had it on, but like, admit that you look fucking fabulous, get ready for the pictures to come out, and take his ass down. What the fuck? While John was in the hospital, his family was taken to stay with family in Boston so that they could be near him. And 3 weeks after the shooting, they all returned home. And when they pulled in, there were police cars already there. They made it clear that the family still needed protection. For 24 hours a day, there were at least 2 guards on the property. Everywhere one of the children went, an officer went with them, including school. And after a few months, the cost of this began to really add up for the town. And so they were like, well, we can't keep giving you like personal escorts every day. We have an alternative option. So they installed an 8-foot fence around their property. They had an alarm system put in place. And then they had a trained guard dog named Max given to the family. And this was like a German Shepherd, but a very, very vicious guard dog. And Cillin hated this. It made her very sad, but it also made her really angry because they ended up having to get rid of their family dog because their family dog was so terrified of this guard dog. And everybody was terrified of the guard dog. She was scared of it. The kids were scared of it. Polly was scared of it. She said that when the kids were in the yard, if John wasn't there, they had to chain Max up because John was the only one the dog would listen to. And she said that if the dog thought that John was in danger in any way, shape, or form, so that likely included, if the kids are horsing around with him, the dog doesn't know what's going on. Like, she was like, that dog will rip your throat out if it thinks that you're hurting my dad. We were terrified of it. But she says that when the shooting took place, that's the beginning of when her family disappeared. So they're home. They have the guard dog. They have the alarm system. But John is just not in a good place mentally, emotionally. He said he stopped playing with his kids. He completely withdrew emotionally. There would be days where he would just spend, like days on end, where he would just stay in his room. He wouldn't come out of it. He said all he could think about was revenge and hate. He said he pushed his wife and his children away. And he and Polly decided the only way that they were going to get away from all of this is they were going to have to move. So his plan was, we'll move, I'll recover fully, I'll get an untraceable gun, and I will kill Mel Rainey. And his plan was to go through the woods across from the dump, and he would wait for Mel Rainey to show up and empty his garbage truck. And while he was sitting there emptying the truck, John would shoot him right through the windshield and he would escape. And ideally, I guess, wouldn't get caught. So they ended up relocating to Tennessee, where they assumed new identities and pretended to be people that they weren't. Polly had been accepted as a nurse there, so she had a job lined up. They were able to sell Max back to the training center, and the town let them keep the money. But John's compensation for being shot in the face at work was $200 a week. And the town was happy to wash their hands of the Busby family because of the expense that they were racking up. When they moved, they were escorted out of town, and John said he assumed the, quote, investigation would end when they left, and he was right. They did their best to fit in. Cylin tried to fit in with new friends and become a new person. She never told anybody what really happened to her father to cause the scars on his face. And John grew a really big beard to hide the fact that he had been shot. For years, the family watched everything to see if anyone was coming for them. If a car drove by their house too slowly, they were on edge. They were very weary of new people. But after a few years, they kind of settled into a normal life. They had a really large farm. John worked on the farm almost as a form of therapy, Polly said. He was always up and moving when he was physically able to, but the rage was still there every single day. So occasionally, John would have to go back to Boston for surgeries. And when he did, he would have to shave the mountain man beard that he'd grown. In the mirror, he would see what Mel Rainey had done to him, and it would make him really angry. And he said on one visit, he saw his uncle. That's who he stayed with when he went for his surgery. And his uncle took him down to the basement, and he was like, hey, I have something to show you. And it was a gun case. And inside of it was a .22 caliber rifle with a scope and a silencer. And John was like, that's exactly what I needed. That's what I needed. But he said he looked at the gun and he wrote a few words down in his notebook and showed it to his uncle. And he said, thank you for all your effort. I won't need it. And he said he got back home after that surgery. He walked in and he didn't say hello or how are you or anything to Polly. He just said, I'm done. I'm done with surgery. I'm done with going back to Boston. I'm done with the hate. And I'm done with revenge. And she was like, I'm done too. That's great. And so they moved forward as new people. In 2003, there was a break in John's case. There was a confession. By this point, the Rainey family had started to turn on each other over money because every single one of them is garbage, which is kind of, I don't know if ironic is the right word. We could ask Alanis Morissette, but he owns a garbage company and every single one of them needs to be thrown in the dumpster as well. So now they're fighting over money. And now they're starting to go to the police and tattle on each other and tell on all the things that they had been doing that they shouldn't have been doing, right? So John Rainey, Mel's brother, decided to come clean about the night that John Busby was shot. He blamed everything on Mel, of course. He said that the night of the shooting, Mel was in the back seat with a ski mask and a shotgun. John Rainey drove, and they approached John Busby's car. He said Mel put the shotgun out the back window, and as they slowly passed, Mel opened fire. So you can't blame all of it on Mel, can you? I think Mel is dirty brown water trash for sure, but John, you are too. You drove the fucking car, my dude. You're not completely absolved from any responsibility here. And unfortunately, justice would not be served because this confession came after the statute of limitations had passed, so they could not legally go after Mel Rainey. I cannot believe that there is a statute of limitations for attempted murder. This man literally, the only reason John Busby did not get murdered that day is because he was too fucking pissed to die. I mean, and he wasn't going to leave without knowing his family was safe. Like, he was shot in the face. Like, bad. I mean, oh my gosh. Mel Rainey would later be institutionalized at Taunton Hospital, suffering from dementia and Pick's disease, and he ended up dying in November of 2013. Oh my gosh. I'm so ridiculous. Okay, this next paragraph tells us what happened to Shirley. He married Shirley Souza. I didn't put it together that the Shirley that he married was the Shirley that was the babysitter. I don't know how I didn't put that together. It seems pretty obvious. Anyway, we are learning things together. In 2005, Shirley Rainey, whom Mel married, was found shot dead in her garage. She was in the middle of a legal battle with Mel's sons regarding the ownership of the garbage company. A man named John Rams was arrested for her murder but was acquitted. And during this trial, it came out that Rainey's sons had hired Rams to steal documents from Shirley's home. Then Rams was asked to shoot Shirley, which he said no to. He claims that he told authorities that Shirley's life was in danger, but officials deny that Rams provided them with this information, and her murder still remains unsolved. That's awful. So yeah, this was the babysitter. So Shirley was the babysitter, and then he married her, and then he had her killed, or his sons had her killed. But I mean, I honestly wouldn't doubt. Now, I don't know what his mental acuity was by 2005 because he died in 2013. I don't know when he went to live in the home. But I mean, I would not freaking doubt that if his sons were like, she won't let us have what we want out of the business, he was like, just kill her then. Like he had no regard for human life. I feel absolutely nothing about him dying and suffering before he died, which is terrible because you don't want to be that way. But like, this guy was awful to everybody. When asked about Mel Rainey's death, John said, quote, "I outlived the bastard, thank goodness. The devil has a playmate or maybe even a boss or co-conspirator. He was hell on earth." But for John Busby, he's like, I won. I'm still here. He's not here anymore. And his mind was gone way before he died. So, and again, it's not something you wish on somebody, but man, what an asshole Mel Rainey was. So that is the case, you guys. Let me know what you think about it, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Love you. Bye. If you like this episode, be sure to like this episode and follow the show so that you never miss out on new episodes. Get in on the conversation on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us at Killer Queens Pod, or you can join our Facebook discussion group at Killer Queens Podcast, where we discuss cases covered on the show and all things 90s. If you want to submit a case to be covered on the show, visit killerqueenspodcast.com/case submission and just complete the form. And if we covered a case, we'll give you a shout out on the show. Lilas.